introduction tonight is going to be, it was going to be through Skype. We're going to play a video, but this is one of the members that Dick Buxton, who
Tyrus Cobb was special assistant to President.
Sorry. Oh, that's okay. I've known Dick Buxton since I was 4 years old. He was a 36-year Rotarian in the San Francisco Rotary Club. He was out for 2.5 years, and he was one of the Rotarians that I speak to that could not come back in the Rotary because this guy travels around the world all the time, day in and day out. And he, when I explained the E-Club to him, he took a liking to it. He says, I not only want to be a presenter at your E-Club, I want to be a member. And Dick has brought some great people to us, from around the world and around the country to E-Clubs. He's helped build the numbers for our district and really helped out a lot. He's also brought this evening a great public speaker who was on President Reagan's staff. And do we have Dick to do that for them? And Dick, through video, is going to give the introduction to Tyrus Cobb, Dr.
Reagan, and was on his National Security Council. He managed U.S. policy on numerous issues impacting the global environment, including climate change, acid rain mitigation, clean air and water policies, and nuclear waste cleanup. Under Colin Powell, he produced comprehensive national strategy on strategic trade. He coordinated policy issues relating to nuclear proliferation. He managed negotiations on international science and technology agreements. He oversaw efforts at regulating global arms sales. He promoted U.S. cooperation with UN and other international organizations. He served as executive director for President Reagan's 2 summits in formulating strategy designed to promote positive change in the former Soviet Union. He was responsible for developing long-term Western consensus for dealing with Moscow. He devised strategy for coordinated NATO West policies in dealing with the USSR. Ty is pragmatic, well-rounded, and uncommonly qualified to see the big picture. He's lived a life of service to others and definitely passes the 4-way test in every way. To you, Dr. Tyrus Cobb.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Dick. And it's a real pleasure to be here with the Rotarians. And I want to thank you before we begin for the service that you performed. I was well aware of a lot of Rotary things. We spent a year, my daughter spent a year in India while she was with the Gates Foundation, working with other partners, but including Rotary. And in fact, while she was at Gates, Rotary was a major recipient of gifts. I have a pleasure today to talk to you about a great American, Ronald Reagan, our 40th president. And as I was telling Greg and Joe, this is going to be interactive, so I get to ask you questions too. This has been about 25 years ago, so some of you won't quite remember. But Ronald Reagan, as I said, was a very interesting person. And as we think back at that time, I love this cartoon. It shows a couple going through divorce proceedings, and the wife turns to the counselor and says about her husband, I gave him the best years of my life, the Reagan years. Reagan was a very common man with uncommon ideals and aspirations. And much of what he did, the person that led him was his wife, Nancy. I've never seen a couple so bound together. Nancy and with Ron, they were a symbiotic relationship. When she wasn't around, he just didn't function as well. He was totally dedicated there to them. They had a great love. And as you'll see as we discuss some of the policy aspects of the Soviet Union, Nancy turned out to be a key advisor as well. As I said, this is a man with a great sense of humor. If you read his autobiography, or if you read his diaries, there are all sorts of funny things in there. I remember once he was writing, he says, well, my guys tell me that Castro is really worried the but I've got something up my sleeve. And he says, well, I just hope my guys can come up with something to justify Castro's worry. He always had this joke, and I think you also recall in 1981 when the president was shot, and he was in the hospital, and Nancy rushed to his bedside, and she says, Ron, what happened? He says, well, honey, I forgot to duck. A great sense of humor. And as you know, if they hadn't rushed him to George Washington, he would have died. It was that close. And as he was going under the knife, he turned to the doctors and said, well, I hope you're all Republicans. And one of the doctors said, today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans. And I think that sort of captures it, that here I am with the president, and that you see that sense of humor. You all aren't from Reno, but in the old days, Reagan was a cowboy hero. And in those days, in the 40s, which Dick Buxton will remember, but they used to, when a new movie would come out from the studios, they would have all of the actors would go to the city that best personified the movie. This one was called Virginia City. And I know it's hard to see, but can you see anybody in this photo? Who is that on the white horse?
Hoppy.
Hopalong Cassidy, right. Bill Boyd be next to him. That's Randolph Scott. And off to the left, just where the guy's raising his hand, just next to him, that's Ronald Reagan on his horse. And so this is what they would do in those days. And, but this image of Reagan, the cowboy, was both a very positive thing and also a negative thing throughout his career and his life. In many ways, he personified the American West. He was the son of California, although he was born in Illinois. Always very close to the ranch life, the simple life, fixing the fences, cutting down trees, and most importantly, riding his horses. During his presidency, he was also a subject of some derision. Oh, that dumb cowboy from California, how's he going to stand up to Gorbachev and all of those guys? One of his closest advisors was our senator from Nevada, Paul Laxalt. When Paul was governor of Nevada, Reagan was governor of California. The two of them worked very closely together. And when the Republicans took the majority of the Senate, Reagan and Laxalt had a good chance to work again together. Now, Reagan had some close advisors. This individual, who is this? Sure. Joe, come on.
I'll go with the crowd, Ed Bates.
That's Ed Bates. And Ed came with him from California, as did Mike Deaver. And these were the Californians, these were the conservatives. But if you remember the 1980 election, he teamed up with George Bush, his rival in the primaries, to be his vice president. Ed was a great guy. He always had a great sense of humor. He's my daughter's godfather. And in 1979, I remember asking Ed, I said, the Republicans are going to have their convention in 1980 in Detroit. And he said, yeah. I said, that's kind of unusual. He says, well, Ty, there's good news and bad news. I said, what's the good news? He said, well, our hotel's only 3 blocks from the convention center. I said, well, what's the bad news? Nobody's spoken yet. But this is the troika that you may recall that was running the White House under President Reagan. You recognize anybody besides Ed Meese there? Jim Baker and Mike Deaver. Mike came with Ed from California. Jim Baker came from the Bush camp, put them together. Baker was an extraordinarily capable chief of staff and later Secretary of Treasury. But there was a split among them. They had very different views. Mike Deaver went closer, became the deputy chief of staff to Bush. So I don't want to tell you everything was harmonious in the White House. There were a lot of internal splits and difficulties. This is Ed Meese up at West Point with my son. When Reagan came in, he had a real strong conservative agenda. But the House of Representatives was in the hands of the Democrats and stayed there for the better part of 40 years. And the longtime Speaker of the House is this gentleman. Who's this? Yeah, you all know Liz. I bet you don't know him. Greg knows. Tim O'Neill, crusty old Irishman, extremely liberal from Massachusetts. And I remember that the two of them would go head to head. They'd be on the phone, and Tim would say, "Well, Mr. President, you're trying to, break the backs of the working man in order to improve the economy for the rich." Reagan would say, "Well, Tip, you just don't understand the capitalist system. We have to have a profit motive there. Can't keep sucking us dry." And Tip would say, "Yeah, but you're going to have to give up this." And Reagan would say, "No, Tip, we're going to." And at the end, then Reagan would say, "Well, Tip, tell you what, why don't you come on by tonight and let's just have a drink and talk it over." And two Irishmen would sit there and have maybe a drink and tell jokes. You don't do that anymore, do you? You may also recall that when Reagan was shot and going under the operation, Tip O'Neill came by his bedside and knelt down and prayed. Don't see it anymore, and that's too bad. But Reagan had a Democratic House the whole time he was there, a Democratic Senate for 6 years, and he knew he had to build up that relationship. But Paul Laxalt helped him in the Senate, but he had to work with Tip in the House. Now, what was his strategy for dealing with the Soviets? Well, largely, Reagan didn't have a strategy. Well, I was in the Soviet Union for the better part of 2 years, and on the night of when Reagan was elected, I was in Moscow, and I was asked to give a talk the next day to a bunch of Central Committee, KGB, and Army officers. And everybody assumed the first thing they would do is what any president does. He wants a summit with the Soviet leader, Brezhnev. No. Reagan said, "I'm not ready. Right now, we're not in a position to be dealing with the Soviets from a position of strength. Until I build up the economy, until I restore the armed forces to their vitality, and most importantly, until the American people have restored our confidence, I'm not prepared to meet with the Soviet leader." I think that was a very wise decision. He knew what he had to do before he met with the Soviets is not only put the domestic house in order, but internationally our alliances were frayed badly. We had very poor relations with the Europeans, the Canadians, and others. So Reagan set out to improve relations. And one of the most important is with our neighbor to the north. At that time, who was the leader of Canada?
Trudeau.
Pierre Trudeau. I want to tell you, this was a horrible relationship with Reagan. It was fraught with tension. They were very different. Trudeau was a liberal. At this time in December 1983, he decided to take Canada to an equidistant place between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, not so much our ally. And Trudeau had a peace plan that was going to preach to the world that, well, let me just put it this way. Look at the expressions on our face. After the meeting, you can see myself on the left, Reagan, Bud McFarlane, my boss, Paul Robinson, our ambassador to the Soviet Union, to Canada, Cap Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, and George Shultz. Look at the looks on those faces. Doesn't that tell you how everybody thought about the relationship? This was going nowhere. Fortunately, Trudeau's popularity sank to 16% in Canada. His Liberal Party was voted off out of office, and who came to power? This guy. Another Irishman, Brian Mulroney. Suddenly, there's another Irishman, another conservative. He could sing beautifully and tell jokes. He and Reagan just hit it off like that. Now look at the faces on all of us. This is outside the White House steps as following me to that previous one. It was a meeting with Trudeau in December '83. Now this is '84, Mulroney and Reagan. And you can see myself, my boss, John Poindexter, Ambassador Robinson, again, Cap Weinberger. It's a new life. A new conservative leader, that relationship is building. Now, Reagan had to build relations with other leaders, too. Perhaps none more important than this, and you know what I'm going to say. This is, again, here, this is just to tell you, and by the way, I've got some materials from the White House if you want to look at them. But this is in the Oval Office, and before a larger meeting with 6 or 7 on a side, there would be a one-on-one between the two leaders. with 1A president. And this one, I'm there with the Canadian ambassador, Derek Burney. So this is, they would go one-on-one, and the two of them would sit there and laugh and tell jokes, but also develop that close relationship. Who is this? Margaret. Has anybody here seen the movie, The Iron Lady? Yes. Disappointment. I mean, a tremendous performance by Meryl Streep, but my God, the whole movie had one brief glimpse of Reagan, one of Gorbachev, and I walked out of there shaking my head like, what was this movie about? But Margaret Thatcher, let me tell you, she was one of the president's closest advisors and confidants. And like Maroney, she followed a Labor government, liberal, and came to power. A very different approach, very tough, and leading the party in a way that was going to take it away from what she considered the socialist path. And let me tell you, Margaret Thatcher took no prisoners. She would come into the Oval Office, she would walk in with that handbag, and we'd all be standing there, and usually there's some niceties, hello, how are you? She'd go right into the president and say, now Ron, you're going to meet with Gorbachev, you're going to, and Ron would say, oh, God, I understand, Margaret, you're right. And she said, yes, and then, he's going to demand this, but we're going to have to stand firm. He said, you're right, Margaret, we're going to do that. And then Ron, we're going to then look over at us and kind of wink. But Mrs. Thatcher, the Prime Minister, was just one of his closest friends and confidants. Again, now you see the change in alliances. Now we have a great friend in Canada, we have a great friend in Britain, in Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister. This is the two of them here, and this is Thatcher and the President at Camp David. I'll just tell you one other story. I love Margaret Thatcher, but I got to tell you, we were in Venice for the Economic Summit in 1987, and because she was junior as a head of government, he was Reagan's head of state, Margaret came to the president for the bilateral. Following the meeting, the advanced people said, let's put them in a gondola together to go over to the meeting place that evening. So Reagan and Margaret got in the gondola with two aides, myself and Charles Poole. Like I tell you, the whole way across in the gondola, here's Margaret going, hey, now we're But she was wonderful. Now I'm going to ask you some questions about this next one. Who else might you think of as another ally, another head of state in Europe? Think about this. Who's this? Who's that? Pope John Paul II. Now you ask me, wait a minute. You're talking about Maroney, the Prime Minister of Canada. You're talking about Thatcher, Prime Minister of Britain, head of government. What is he ahead of? The Pope, is, in addition to being the spiritual leader of the worldwide Catholics, is also the head of state. Now, Joe, you're going to get this wrong, but what state is the Pope the head of? No, it's the Holy See. It's technically a state. The entity is called the Holy See, and so the Pope is the head of state of the Holy See in this area that we call the Vatican. And as head of state, he also would have a national security advisor, Cardinal Casaroli. What transpired between Reagan and the Pope that was so important this time? What were they like-minded about? Let me give you a hint. Where was the Pope from? Poland, the Polish Pope. Who was ruling Poland at that time?
Wałęsa.
No. At that time, it was still under communist rule. It was Marshal Jaruzelski who would have imposed martial law in Poland. So Poland was ruled by the Polish Communist Party and under a military semi-dictatorship of Marshal Jaruzelski. And this is the Pope's homeland. And a lot of people don't know this story, but the Pope and Reagan, in their private conversations, hatched a plan for the freedom of Eastern Europe, beginning with Poland. And this involved spiritual aid, but also funneling of money, arms, but most importantly, printing presses. Sami stopped printing at that time, way before social media. So it was cranking it out on the blue Xerox machines, or those, what do you call the blue? You wouldn't remember that. Yeah, Greg remembers.
No, I do.
You know, those things.
My hand.
And Reagan enlisted a lot of allies. And you know who's chief ally domestically? It was the AFL-CIO, Leonard Woodchuck. The Federation of Labor is AFL-CIO. Because they wanted to have their sister labor organization, which was called what? Solidarity, or Solidarność in Polish. And it was headed by whom? Lech Walesa. And so we were funneling aid through the CIA, through the Catholic Church, through the AFL-CIO, designed to bring down the communist government and begin the disintegration of Soviet domination over Eastern Europe. A lot of people haven't heard this story. You deserve to hear it, and it's true. So the two of these would work on this together. We were in the Vatican in a meeting with the Pope. By the way, I'll tell you a joke. The president had gone on one of these crazy tours when he first got elected, and they had him overly scheduled. They got to meeting with the Pope. The Pope was droning on. It was a hot room, and the president was falling asleep. Everybody got all upset. So we knew this time the president and the Pope are talking. The cameras are there. I mean, all the world's press, and all they want to see is the president nod off, right? So Reagan would sit there, and I love the Pope. He was droning on, and it was hot. And then you see Reagan go like that, you know. Then all the cameras would go off, and he just break it. And then he'd be sitting there and kind of going like this, and he'd go, and you know, there's all the cameras. They always missed it. The Pope went by and said to each of us, he gave us the St. Christopher's medal and said, "Bless you." And I said, "Dziękuję," in Polish, thank you. He says, "Proszę Pana, you're welcome." Afterwards, the Secret Service guys came up. "What were you talking to the Pope about?" No, I can't tell you. But that's a story, and they met several times, and then they had a secret channel, and that began the dissolution of Soviet rule in Eastern Europe, with Poland first. More about that a little bit later. And again, I love this photo of the president with Pope John Paul II. Another leader, now this may seem to you to be a little more difficult. Who is this gentleman? Huh? Francois Mitterrand, who was the president of France. Now he was the only one of the rank of Reagan, head of state. Everybody else was head of government. So he and Reagan were at the top in protocol, but he got elected 3 months after Reagan, so he was always junior in protocol, and it pissed him off all the time. And he was just constantly trying to undermine the president. It was a difficult relationship between the two of them. Mitterrand was the leader of the Socialist Party. He had taken France on a socialist economic path in 1981 that, quite frankly, proved disastrous. By 1983, he had kind of reversed that policy and was going in the other direction, and the French economy was picking up. So the president kind of set him up. We're in a meeting in the cabinet room, and the president says, "Well, Francois, tell me about your new economic strategy." So Mitterrand did, said, "Well, Ron, and we're doing..." Reagan says, "Well, I don't know, Francois. Sounds an awful lot like Reaganomics to me." Mitterrand says, "Well, whatever you want to call it, it worked." But it was a difficult relationship. But what you got to consider is domestically, who was Mitterrand's political enemy? It was on the left, the communists. His enemies domestically were on the left, the Communist Party. Internationally, he was very hard on the Soviet Union, perhaps actually our closest ally in our viewpoint toward the Soviets. So even though he was a socialist, we had a close relationship. Here's a funny story. I've got to tell you a couple of anecdotes. This is actually in 1986. We're celebrating in Governor's Island in New York Harbor the 100th anniversary of what? France gave us the Statue of Liberty. So this was the 100th anniversary. Ah, beautiful day, the sun is shining, and this is the French delegation. Well, this lovely young lady, she didn't look so good in this picture, was part of the French delegation the year before when we were in Britain, and the French came in for a bilateral, and there were 7 on the French side, 7 of us, and as they were leaving, this lovely young thing was with Mitterrand. And so Reagan turns to our ambassador in France, Van Galbraith. He says, Van, who was that lovely young lady with Francois? And Van says, oh, Mr. President, that's Yvette Guizot. Reagan says, well, what does she do? Well, Mr. President, that's his economics advisor. Reagan says, what does she know about economics? And Van starts, because Reagan's that economic advisor, Marty Feldstein. And Van said, well, Mr. President, he said, okay, Van. Okay, I'll tell you what, next time you see Francois, tell him I'll trade him straight across from Marty Feldstein. and I'll throw in a Cadillac. The president could have that viewpoint. We went to France on June 6, 1984. 40th anniversary of what? The D-Day landing. Anybody recognize where we are here? This is Pointe du Hoc. Well, it's right near Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. But this is Pointe du Hoc. This is where the Rangers scaled the cliff, and they went 263 feet straight up with the German guns pointed down on it. And some of the Rangers who survived that assault were there that day. And Peggy Noonan helped the president write the speech, but it was one of the most moving when he saluted the boys at Pointe du Hoc. But these were the things that, even though we had a socialist prime minister here, we had a socialist prime minister in Italy, Craxi. His biggest enemy were the communists, and he was tough on the Soviets. So was Suarez in Portugal and the Spanish. So he was building this alliance. We were also, this is Utah Beach, Omaha Beach. President and Mrs. Reagan going through the cemetery. I'm going to come back to the cemetery thing in just a minute. Now, as the president getting ready to deal with the Soviet Union, he had brought things together, working well with Germany, because now Germany even had a conservative chancellor, Helmut Kohl. So now and the economy's picking up. By 1981, 82, 83, the president's feeling better. But he had a problem. The Soviet Union had an aging leadership. Initially under this man. Who is this? Huh? Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev had been in office long, and I got to tell you, by the time Reagan came in, Brezhnev had been drinking so much he could barely stand up and walk. But boy, he was actually in World War II, he was a political commissar. So he's wearing the Medal of Geroi Sovietskого Soyuza, hero of the Soviet Union, and he's wearing the Marshal rank, the highest rank, Marshal Sovietsky Soyuza, that he's got the Vietnam Good Conduct Medal. Oh no. Sorry. But we call it, you have a rule of the few, the oligarchy, and what we call what was ruling the Soviet Union, the gerontocracy. It was the rule of the old. And they were old, and they weren't moving very fast. And that impetus that the Soviets had had under Carter seemed to be going out of steam. They were being repelled in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And Brezhnev was the epitome of this. Well, this man died, and who replaced Brezhnev? Huh? No, Yuri Andropov. Well, big change. Do you remember what Andropov's job was at the time? Head of the KGB, right. So now suddenly the head of the KGB is promoted to the general secretary, the top job. But the rumor was he liked jazz, Ella Fitzgerald, he drank scotch, had Western ideas. Maybe it's time for a change. The same guy that we call the Butcher of Budapest in '56, I remember that. The problem was, Andropov came in, immediately got sick. He only ruled for about 18 months and was totally incapacitated. So people used to criticize Reagan, you're not dealing, you're not reaching out to the Soviet Union. He says, well, I keep calling and nobody answers. And that was a problem. So now, finally, in 1984, Andropov dies. Now, you're going to get this wrong, but who replaced Andropov as the leader of the Soviet Union? Nobody knows. This man, Konstantin Chernenko, 84 years old, youth movement, right? Well, it was the same old thing. Back, Chernenko, they had to literally wind him up and take him to the podium, and he would speak. And, it was getting to be election year, we wanted to get some movement, but the Soviet leadership was in this stasis. Now, at this time, because of the decrepit nature of the Soviet leadership, I know this is controversial, a lot of people blame us, Reagan, but what had happened in the Soviet Union is that a war hysteria broke out. Because the leadership wasn't reaching out for various sources of information, what they were getting was the husha, the lucha, the worse the better. So the worse news, the better. And the KGB and the inside part of the Communist Party kept feeding them information. The U.S. is planning an attack. Reagan's planning a first strike. True story. And so some of our people that were over there said there's sort of a war hysteria among the leadership. They're convinced themselves of this. And we made some stupid statements too that fed this. And the Reagan military buildup. True story. Middle of 1983, on a Soviet missile site, they detected that we had in fact launched that first strike. And the order went down to the missile commander, fire the retaliatory ICBMs, because if you don't, once you're hit, you're gone. So you have to fire right away. You got 30 minutes. And the colonel said, no, this doesn't look right. What? We gave you an order. Fire the ICBMs. No, you're relieved. Somebody else, get in there. Now, fire those ICBMs. Then suddenly, wait! It's a flock of birds in Montana. That's how close we came. And that lieutenant colonel, to my knowledge, is still alive and has been interviewed. He said, yes, that's a true story. That's how close we came. So one day we'd be dealing with things of this magnitude, and then shortly thereafter, you would get a call like I did one day, because there's two of us doing all of Europe, and I'm doing Soviet stuff, Canada. And the Icelandic ambassador calls me. I said, Mr. Ambassador, this is an honor, but what's on your mind? And he's sputtering. He says, Dr. Cobb. I said, just, Mr. Ambassador, he says, I just want you to be the first to know that tomorrow Iceland is breaking diplomatic relations with the United States, and you'll be out of your base in Keflavik within a year. Whoa. How many of you have read Hunt for the Red October? The Clancy books. Well, what did we do in Keflavik in Iceland? We monitored. See, if you look at this, the Soviets' warm water ports are actually in the north, so they had to come out of Murmansk around Norway and through that narrow, what we call the Greenland-UK gap by Iceland. That's the way we kept track of their subs. We're going to be out of Keflavik. This is where all our P3s keep track of the Soviet subs. I said, Mr. Ambassador, I'm thinking, what the hell is this? What's the issue? He said, well, whales, of course. Whales. Whales the country, cod war, whales mammal, whales what? Well, I said, right, let me get right back to this. So I called the State Department and said, what, excuse my language, is going on with Iceland? Oh, yeah, this is, well, you never told me. What is this? Well, the crux of it was that Iceland felt correctly that we were behind the new International Whaling Council ban on whaling. And that was true. Our Commerce Department really had pushed it. No more whaling. This is an issue that's very dear to us. Well, that really upset the Norwegians, the Russians, the Japanese, but especially the Icelanders who've been doing this for 1,000 years, and we're going to come along and tell them they can't go out and kill whales. So they're terribly upset. So one day we're worried about a missile strike from the Soviet Union. The next day I'm in the Oval Office with the president talking about whales. And we're going on, and the president turned to me and said, "Well, Ty, how many whales are there?" I'll get right back. So I went outside, and who would I call? I called the Commerce Department, NOAA, National Oceanographic, got the deputy. He's got a call from the White House. He said, "What's up?" And I said, "The president wants to know how many whales there are." He said, "What?" I said, "Listen, I got 10 minutes. Call me back and tell me how many whales there are. That's all. I don't have time." He called back in 10 minutes and said, I'll never forget, 739,645. I don't know how we got it, so I went back in, told the president. Well, of course, it's species specific, and it's a Bambi issue. It doesn't really matter. But we worked it out. They could kill 14 a year for scientific purposes. And we worked it out. But just to tell you, one day you're worried about this attack from Chernenko, who's on his last legs, and then the next day, things changed. Well, March 1985, Chernenko finally dies. The Soviets are faced with a tremendous choice. Go back with the old guard again, Gromyko's there, or do we go with the younger, more dynamic leadership? Knowing that we got serious economic problems. And they did. And they chose this man. Who is this? Mikhail Gorbachev. At the time, 54 years old, came out of Stavropol, close ties to the KGB. He understood the plight of the Soviet Union. And all of a sudden, he's a reformer, remember? He's got perestroika, he's restructuring the Soviet Union. He's got glasnost, to openness. You know, we're going to make the Soviet Union more open. And he captures the Europeans, and we're trying to deploy missiles at that time, remember, in retaliation what the Soviets had, the Pershing II and the ground-launched cruise missiles, the Glickums. And hundreds of thousands of Germans are on the street protesting, Italians are protesting. This is the darling of Europe now. He's the reformer, things are going to change. And oh, by the way, who's leading the U.S.? Well, that doctrine, old cowboy Reagan. Hidebound in his views, no match for that young Gorbachev. Well, we, of course, we're going to wind up meeting with him, and the president welcomed it, Nancy welcomed it. A lot of his advisors over at CIA, Bob Gates was then the deputy director, were saying, don't meet with him, he can't, they're not going to change, they're the same old people. Reagan said, I'm going to meet with him. So we set a date, going to meet in Geneva, 1985, and it's going to be this first summit with the Soviet leader in Reagan's presidency. And here's this bright young Gorbachev. So, well, that means we got to get the president up to speed, because, where's that book? There's 10,000 issues, and you can look at this. This is unclassified press book version of all of the major issues in Geneva. Each one of them a page only. And the president suddenly has got to worry about agriculture policy, oil, leverage, Soviet support of national liberation movements, what they're doing in Afghanistan. So we're having these briefing sessions, and we're getting the president up to speed. Here's one where with Vice President Bush, the president, Secretary Schultz, my boss, Bud McFarland, myself. And then we're bringing in some key advisors. And here's, again, the same group. We're having a whole series of meetings. I was in charge of coordinating the preparation of the president and bringing in the experts. And this included Dick Pipes. Here's Bob Gates. Ironically, then Bob was the deputy director of the CIA. So, you know, they're not going to change. And we're having all of these meetings, and the president, you know, finally, one day, about 3 weeks before the meeting, just says, stop, that's it. We said, what do you mean stop, Mr. President? We got all these things you have to cover. He said, no, that's it, no more preparation. But Mr. President, he said, look, I've been preparing for this meeting for 40 years. If I'm not ready now, I'm never going to be ready. Ooh, okay. And he took that sense of humor. And so, on a very cold day, we went up to Geneva, and this is on Air Force One. Myself, with the president. You can see, we're uptight. We're thinking this Gorbachev's so quick and facile. The president's a little older, but he's laughing and telling jokes. And we said, well, maybe he's got it. And we went over there, and the president stayed in the Aga Khan's residence in Geneva. And we're like, okay, Mr. President, this is going to be a big meeting, but first we're going to meet with the Swiss president as a courtesy, because since we're in Switzerland, referred to her. And one thing I remember from that meeting, and here's a haughty Swiss, and they're talking to this cowboy, and they're saying, well, Mr. President, can you tell us about your Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative, which we all think is rather foolish, because, we rely on mutual assured destruction, and why are you changing things? I'll never forget the president said, well, President Bergler, I can't help but think that I come back to the city, I come here to the city of Geneva, where some 40 years ago, all the nations of the world came together to sign the Geneva Convention outlawing the most inhumane aspects of warfare. And I come here as the leader of one of two superpowers who base their strategy on the mutual annihilation of each other's populations. I gotta think there's a better way, don't you? What did the Swiss say? Oh no, we like that? Ooh, so the guy was ready. So the next day, we're gonna have, get ready for our meeting. And it's a cold day, it's about 20 degrees, but bright blue skies. And Gorbachev, being junior, and actually had no government position, he was General Secretary of the Communist Party, came first to meet the president for the bilaterals. And Gorbachev drives up in this big, heavy Soviet Geo limousine. He gets out, he's got this big, heavy coat on, he's got the schlop hat and a scarf. The door opens and Reagan bounds off with nothing on but a dark blue suit and a big smile. We all said, he's got it. And in many ways they did. And after about an hour into the meeting, the president said, look, Mikhail, or there's still Mr. General Secretary, let's just you and I go down one-on-one with our translators, down to the dacha, we'll build a fire, and let's just talk and get to know each other. So Gorbachev said, well, sure, let's do that. We were down at the dacha, that was a signal. We told the advance team to start the fire, get everything ready, they're coming down. We turned around, the wind had blown the drapes into the fire, the drapes caught on fire. We're telling them, stop, don't come down, we're beating the drapes up. And they came in just as we were going out the back door with the drapes. So they had a highly successful meeting, 3 days of the toughest negotiations, and finally at 2:30 in the morning on the last day, the guys in the negotiation called me and said, because I'm writing the president's speech in NATO the next day, it's the Soviets, Gorby caved. It's going to be a successful summit, and it was. This was a triumph for Reagan and for Gorbachev, and he came back to tremendous support. Well, the next year goes on. This is me at the end of that summit. Drago Air Force One in the background, and I was just wiped out from all that. Well, next year we're going to go back again. We're going to Reykjavik, and this was supposed to be just let's just have a pre-summit. Well, the Soviets came loaded for bear. They had arms control proposal. We're going to wipe out classes of weapons. We're going to reduce strategic weapons by 50%. These are things we wanted to do. Suddenly they're willing to do it. And we're going round and round and like this. And we thought this was going to be the most earth-shaking, far-reaching agreements of all time, the two of them there. And on the last day, Gorbachev said, well, of course it's all contingent on you doing what? Star Wars. You've got to confine your work on Star Wars to the laboratory and research. And Reagan says, no, we're going to have to test it. We need defensive, and we'll share it with you. So he says, no, you've got to confine it. They were so worried, and a lot of us thought Star Wars, it didn't make a lot of sense that we could actually do this stuff. It didn't matter what Tyrus Cobb thought. Gorbachev and the Soviets thought we could. And we would, for once and all, marry up our strategic, economic power and our military force, and we would leave them in the dustbin of history, to use a Marxist term. And so the meeting in Reykjavik collapsed last minute. They're both downbeat, 8:30 at night, and the president's leaving, and Gorbachev said, well, Mr. President, I don't know what else we could have done. Reagan says, well, you could have said yes. So that was a downer. But we came back, we're regrouping, and one day I pick up a newspaper, and it said the U.S., the Lebanese report says the U.S. is selling arms to Iran. That's ridiculous. So I walked across, going by over toward the Oval Office, and walked by our Executive Secretary, and I said, Bob, what was that stupid article in the Washington Post today? He just looked up and said, Ty, don't ask. Oh my God. So I went to, Ollie and I worked together for 4 years. We could tell Ollie stories all night long. I went in there, and Ollie and Fawn Hall, they're shoving papers into the shredder as fast as they can. And yeah, you can call it what you want, but we were trading arms for hostages. And the Reagan administration almost collapsed right there. And everybody was virtually replaced. Don Reagan was booted out. The National Security Advisor, John Poindexter, was booted out, my boss. And a few of us were asked to stay, but by and large they cleaned house. And brought in a new team with the guy on the right, Frank Carlucci, is the new National Security Advisor, Cal Weinberg, still Secretary of Defense. Well, Carlucci is named to be the National Security Advisor, and he said, who's going to be your deputy? He said, well, there's only one person, Colin Powell, so he called Colin. Colin is a 3-star Army officer. He just got to Germany. He's commanding a corps, 2 divisions, an armored cav regiment. He's got his own railroad. And Colin says, you know, Frank, I love you. I'd do anything for you and the president, but I'm a career Army officer, that's where I got to be. 2 days later, Frank called back and said, Colin, only you can do it. You got to come back. Colin says, you know, I'd love to, but I can't. Next day, Colin gets a call. Colin, this is the president. I'd really like you to come back. So guess who came back? So Colin came back to be the Deputy National Security Advisor, and under Frank Carlucci and Colin, then Frank became Secretary of Defense. Colin became the National Security Advisor, and things began to pick up. Things that after Reagan had gone downhill. But as I wrap this up, as the Reagan administration was in its last year and a half, suddenly we began to pick up some steam. Gorbachev realized he needed an arms control agreement. He came to Washington in 1987 in the fall. Great visit. We signed the INF Treaty limiting missiles. The next year, we signed the START Treaty eliminating or limiting strategic arms, all the stuff we wanted to do. But the president continued to speak the truth. None more so than one day in June 1987 when he went to Berlin as a favor to Chancellor Kohl to give a speech in front of this place. Where is this? The Brandenburg Gate, right in front of the Berlin Wall. And this was hotly contested what the president wanted to say, and he decided to keep that phrase in. And in the middle of the speech, he said, Mr. Gorbachev, if you truly believe in peace, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. That's why I wish Dana Rohrabacher could have been in speech right. I think that was one of the most defining moments of the presidency. Despite that, things stayed on track, and what happened? As the Reagan presidency came to an end, shortly thereafter, in fact, the Berlin Wall collapsed 6 months after Reagan left office. 6 months later, the two Germanys reunite. Shortly after that, Gorbachev and Reagan meet again. United Germany joins NATO. Unheard of. And finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, as the Marx would say, on the ash heap of history. And as the president looked back in his last speech from the Oval Office, oh, I love this photo, he and Gorbachev at the ranch. This is long after. But as Reagan looked back in his last days in office, his speech, one of the things he always talked about is he wanted the United States to be that shining city on the hill, that we always would strive to be better than anything else. And he's, in many ways, said, I feel during his last 8 years, in many ways we've achieved it. And I look at this, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Berlin Wall coming down, Germany being reunited. As the president modestly said, all in all, not bad at all. And I would agree, Mr. President, not bad at all. Thank you.